Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning if you're on that side of the world. Thanks for joining us for Enter the Mind of the Mobile Hacker. My name is Scott King, and I will moderate this webinar today. We've got two esteemed speakers, two great security experts from Zimperium and from Mobile Iron. We've got Mike Rago, who's the Director of Security Research at Mobile Iron. Mike applies over 20 years of security technology experience and evangelism into the technical delivery of all types of mobile security solutions. He's a frequent speaker and has even briefed the Pentagon and the FBI. Very, very interesting. Mike has also authored quite a few books, and we'd like to offer you a direction to that at the end of the webinar. Our other speaker from Zimperium is John Patterson. John is our SVP of Pre-Sales Engineering. We're proud to have him working with us. John's worked in security for his entire career in consulting and pre-sales and leadership positions across R&D and all types of pre-sales activity. He's got a strong background in malware and exploit research and analysis. He's a frequent speaker at industry events, and hopefully you've heard him speak before. It's a very interesting accent. I love it. But what we want to do today is really take, what is the state of the mobility? What are some of the known vulnerabilities? And really take a dive into what hackers look for from a network and apps and malware and device perspective. And then as we go on today, please think of questions that you would like to ask the speakers. We'll leave about 5 minutes at the conclusion of the webinar to go into a live Q&A with each of our guys, and they'll offer our perspectives on each of the subjects that we're going to go through today. But really why we're all here is we're here because our computing habits have changed with the adoption of mobile. So many organizations now allow employees to offer mobility programs and offer different enterprise services on our mobile phones. And these are our own phones or corporate provisioned phones. And they each behave differently, and each of those programs offer different capabilities. So employees bring all types of mobile apps into the workplace, and they also bring lots of variables in terms of how to secure all this information and corporate data. But with all this enablement, what it also does is it offers the opportunity for threats, for hackers, for malware, for all types of intrusions to happen via these mobile devices. So we really want to look at that today and understand how do we secure all of this information as all of us run around all over the globe with high-powered computing devices in our pocket. So with that, I want to take it and leave that to Mike to really take over and help us understand why mobile is different. Mike, go right ahead.
Great, thank you. So in terms of mobile, we see three key differences in the mobile space. First being the fact that mobile leverages a different type of operating system that leverages more of a sandbox approach in which apps and their data are segmented or separated from one another. Now, granted, users can interact with the apps and open up a document, say maybe they receive in the email app, and then open that document in a secondary app, edit it, and then thirdly, upload it to Dropbox or something like that. But the key point here is that fundamentally very different than the PC, right? In the PC world, all apps essentially have access to all data. The second key difference is that the network edge has become a lot more blurred. Now that, around the time of the emergence of all of these mobile devices, we also had the explosion of cloud, and as a result, various ways in which people can collaborate in the cloud in terms of documentation collaboration, sharing various types of documents, videos, other types of things. And as a result, data lives everywhere. And then the third thing is that users are becoming more of the low-hanging fruit. If you've got a BYOD scenario, users own the device, they bring it into work, they've configured it the way that they want it, and then they want to connect it to your environment and access corporate data. So how do you secure that, knowing that there's this shared relationship in which no longer is IT pre-configuring the PC and handing it over to the user with all the appropriate lockdowns, but you've got a new device coming in that's owned by the user, and now you've got to find a way to secure that data.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. It's interesting. The user is always the lowest hanging fruit, right? So how do we help protect ourselves? And so with all of this, John, where's the research going with mobile?
Well, as corporate enterprises and as users of mobile devices ourselves, we continue to grow the usage and ultimately the value of the information on the device or that the device has access to becomes more and more interest for the security researcher. What's interesting is to look at the trends and focus of research efforts around vulnerabilities to mobile devices. Desktop devices, Windows, Mac OS X are still favorites from a research perspective, but there's a huge opportunity as a researcher to find new and interesting vulnerabilities on less tested platforms, and mobility certainly would fall into that category. What you're looking at here is a comparison of the publicly listed vulnerabilities from a historical perspective of the number of years. What's interesting to look at here is in 2015, there's been a good growth continuously over the last few years. What's interesting to note is the amount of effort that's been spent also around iOS. So, iOS is often perceived as a much more secure platform. It has some great security capabilities around it, but the research community itself is really spending a lot of time and effort in finding new and interesting ways to be able to compromise these devices, because ultimately that will then provide them potential access to some very valuable corporate information. So, what is the attacker typically looking to, or what vectors are the attackers typically leveraging today that we see from a security perspective on mobile devices? So, if we take a look here at the bottom of the diagram here, network attacks, these are not analogous explicitly to mobile devices, but as mobile devices are on 24/7 and have a predisposition to connect aggressively to both public Wi-Fi networks and Wi-Fi networks that they have connected to previously, that provides the attacker a much broader attack surface. And there's a number of different attacks and mechanisms attackers can use to get access to that data or leverage the user, as Mike pointed out before, in some sort of social engineering position. Application attacks are on the growth. Mike and I'll talk about that in a moment, but both attacking app vulnerabilities in applications themselves and providing malicious apps as a vehicle to gain more privileged or persistent access to a mobile device is of interest. Ultimately, what's dear to heart from the attacker's perspective, and really the holy grail from an attack perspective, is being able to compromise and gain further access and privilege to the device. That allows the attacker a number of different value propositions. One of them is, of course, access to other components of the phone system, contacts, getting access and data from the device itself. But one less considered one is also using the device as a pivot inside a corporate network. Quite often, my experience has shown me that mobile devices are often not segmented in a corporate network, say from corporate-owned desktop devices, and a mobile device is an interesting and unique attack vector. So these are really some of the core areas that we see from a mobile threat perspective that attackers are really spending their time and effort ultimately to gain access to these resources.
Okay, perfect. So, we'll dive into each one of these device attacks, application attacks. Mike, why don't you explain, what the hackers look for in the network?
Sure. So in terms of the network, we know that users travel, and when they travel, we know that they connect to open Wi-Fi or shared, secure Wi-Fi in airports, hotels, and coffee shops. And in fact, we just released a video that kind of demonstrates some of these threats. But what we commonly find is that a lot of these old school Wi-Fi attacks that have been around for some time continue to impact devices and are now even more targeted at mobile devices. And as a result, if you have a user that goes into a coffee shop and they want to connect to the open Wi-Fi so that they can check their corporate email, so that they can VPN into the corporate network, so that they can connect to resources in the cloud owned by the enterprise. In all of those circumstances, there's certainly a potential for a lot of risks stemming from them possibly connecting to a rogue access point, to an evil twin or a fake AP set up by a malicious attacker. And as a result, there's a number of things that can be performed by the attacker, ranging from interception attacks to impersonation or man-in-the-middle attacks. And so when the user goes to connect to the remote network, whether it be back at the corporate enterprise network or in the cloud for that matter, the attacker can try to present a fake certificate and as a result masquerade as the actual endpoint that the user is trying to connect to. When this occurs, the attacker can then leverage the opportunity to not only intercept the data, but also decrypt it and read the actual data. So one of the techniques that we use, for example, at MobileIron is the ability from a proactive standpoint that when we deploy profiles for email, for web access, for access to SharePoint, file shares, CIFS, and other types of things, we can additionally provide a client certificate and enable that mutual authentication. So when the user goes to connect to the resource now, not only is the user trying to validate the endpoint that they're connecting to, but the server side is also validating the identity of the user. So now if the attacker in a man-in-the-middle attack presents a fake certificate, that mutual authentication handshake fails, no VPN or per-app VPN connectivity tunnel is set up, no data is communicated, and no data is exposed. But also these attacks occur, and that's why from a detection standpoint, why using Zimperium is so important.
Hey, perfect. Thanks, Mike. And I think we want to talk about a specific example that maybe we've all heard of in the news. John, what are some of the most famous network type attacks?
Mike talked, at Zimperium, we see a huge amount of network-based attacks to mobile devices. Mike talked about man-in-the-middle there, rogue access points, something that's also very popular. Even we've seen incidents on trains that are providing mobile-based services to workers. An interesting example, though, we think of man-in-the-middle as something that users are often involved in. That is, they're trying to collect data, or in Mike's case, he gave an example of securing apps. I think as an industry, we still have a long way to go there. App pinning is something that a lot of developers still don't do, but we never consider the impact necessarily to the device from even from simple wireless network manipulation. A good example this year was actually with SwiftKey. Now, SwiftKey is an embedded keyboard on Samsung devices, and this system has a privileged access. It's in the privileged portion of that device, and it updates itself proactively over the network. It was discovered, however, that if one was to tamper with that traffic, and unfortunately SSL was not used in this case, an attacker could quite easily insert a response back that allowed a payload to be then installed directly on that device. So really, unfortunately, you had a situation where an attacker can compromise the system portion of a device simply through manipulating wireless networks. So we see a lot of investigation. I know the research community are always very interested in how apps behave because they're looking for abilities to leverage man-in-the-middle based attacks. As I say, as Imperium, this is definitely something that we see a lot of trends on. So we're going to be producing a number of reports. We have a huge install and sensor base that provide and are prepared to provide threat intelligence with us. And what you'll see is a broad range of countries where you'll see or potentially run into network attacks. The US is very strong from an incident perspective. We see a lot of activity in the US. China, we see a lot of traveling executive staff to China, but also to a broad range of European-based countries as well, all the way out to the Middle East. The bottom line is we're facing a challenge where the users are really trying to gain access. Traveling employees are probably the most challenging case, and attackers will leverage that. The tools, one can buy some very straightforward tools to provide this. $90 will buy you a community research product called Wi-Fi Pineapple that allows you to simulate a lot of wireless networks. So one of the things that we'll be providing to our customers in the near future is also the ability to be able to be proactively warned around Wi-Fi networks. As I say, we capture a lot of information about these types of incidents and challenges, and it's always better to be forewarned and forearmed. So New York is actually an interesting discussion point. New York itself is spending multiple millions of dollars to provide a metropolitan-wide Wi-Fi network, and with that becomes some new interesting attack vectors for attackers as well.
Hey, well, perfect. Thanks, John. It's a good review of all types of network attacks, and the data is really interesting. It's surprising how many threats that we see out there. So now that we've covered, really the network type attacks, Mike, what are hackers looking in terms of the applications that we have on our devices?
Sure, yeah. So the second trend that we see in our security research is that hackers are looking more and more to the app. And this really is sort of a evolution from the PC world to the mobile world. In the PC world, we were so accustomed to possibly receiving viruses, malware, infected files, either as an attachment to an email, through a phishing attack, through web browsing sessions and downloading of a file, and things that would actually infect the PC operating system from a file perspective. And once that occurs, of course, it impacts the entire operating system. When we look at it from a mobile perspective, as we spoke about earlier, of course, mobile leverages more of an application sandboxing approach. And in addition, there are additional kernel protections that are fundamental to the mobile operating system. So as a result, sort of the low-hanging fruit now for attackers is to focus more on infections through apps, whether it be apps that are downloaded outside a curated app store, whether it be a curated app store that had some possible apps that were infected with malware, like we saw with the App Store and with Xcode Ghost, where developers were using Xcode from sites other than Apple, designing iOS apps and unknowingly infecting them with malware and then uploading them to iTunes for folks to download. So, it's interesting to see this evolution occur. In terms of the stats, we've also seen that, when we take a look at the statistics we have, across our customer base, that we see 1 in 10 enterprises has at least one device that's compromised. So it's quite an interesting statistic. 10% of enterprises, from what we see, have at least one compromised device that could expose enterprise data.
So 2015's been particularly interesting for me on a number of different fronts from a mobile app malware perspective. I think there's a number of different data points for us as industry and for those of us that spend any time doing research. First off, on the iOS side, obviously we had several potential cases that showed iOS apps were also a potential attack vector. It was already known, and we'd seen incidents, especially when it came to surveillance based technology. There was interesting situations last year with the hacking team and their surveillance products that targeted both iOS and Android from a surveillance perspective. We saw, of course, iOS-based malware itself, the KeyRaider, Y-Inspector situations. Android has always been known for or have been aligned more to the malware, the malicious app thought process. What's been interesting this year, at least in 2015, is a shift in the effort and the complexity of malware. This year, in 2015, we saw a growth of the number of apps that provided additional payloads to be able to fully exploit the devices. I personally reverse engineered and looked at some samples myself, and these were not only providing a broad range of exploits to be able to gain persistence on the device, but what was interesting and is trending in the same way that we saw on the desktop side is now a heavier use of obfuscation. Why are attackers doing that? They're making it more and more difficult for researchers and for security technologies to be able to detect that. In some of these cases, we even saw AES level encryption being used to protect these final payloads that ultimately would be able to compromise the devices. So interesting to see, but very analogous to what we've already seen historically there on the desktop.
Perfect. Yeah, this the applications. I think that's like the most frequently asked question is, how do I protect myself, and are my applications malicious on my device? Mike, speaking of that, what about the device? How are the hackers looking to the device and capturing information?
Sure. So the third trend that we see are that hackers are looking to the device. Earlier, John and Scott spoke to the continued increase in device vulnerabilities, and with a particular uptick, with iOS. And in addition to that, when we talk to customers about a jailbroken iOS device, a rooted Android device, or more broadly, OS compromises, of which there can be lots of variants, one of the things we try to get across to folks is that, if you do have a user that jailbreaks an iPhone or roots their Android device, that you're essentially bringing that security down to the level of a Windows 7 laptop. We all know that there's been a myriad of different vulnerabilities that have impacted Windows 7. So ensuring the integrity and security posture of that device on an ongoing basis is really key in mobile. One really good example that we have here on the screen is a demo that I do at some of the hacker and security conferences, that we speak at, shows like DEF CON. And in this example, a lot of folks think about, okay, great, so somebody jailbreaks their iPhone or their iPad, or somebody roots their Android device. While a lot of folks may be familiar with the fact that kind of breaks the application sandboxing, allows apps to speak to one another, certainly opens up a new attack surface to the attacker, it also makes it vulnerable on the network. So in this case, we've got a jailbroken iPhone, and now that this user is traveling around, connects to an open Wi-Fi or even a secure Wi-Fi that's using encryption, AES encryption, pre-shared key, whatever level of security you might be using, most likely somebody can remotely log into this device. So if you have someone on the same network, they can secure shell in, and unless the user has changed the default username and password on most all iOS devices, which is a username of root and a password of Alpine, unless they've changed that password, anybody can secure shell in to the device, log in with a password of Alpine, and have access to the device. In our research, our testing, And the analysis that we've done, rarely do we come across a user that's jailbroken their iPhone and changed the password from Alpine to something else. So just keep that in mind. Even if it's a secure Wi-Fi network, unless you're using any client isolation, which most people are not, that device is vulnerable.
Device exploitation is something that's very dear to Zimperium's heart, and actually is ultimately where we started our research efforts. At Zimperium, we have a very strong research team. We work around the clock looking to understand the methodologies of attackers on both the iOS and Android platforms, and really thinking like the attacker, trying to understand the next steps that they may potentially take as well. And we've spent a lot of time and effort around mitigations in this area as well. So the ability for us to provide immediate detection of device exploitation across across iOS and Android platforms is very critical for us. Because as Mike says, we don't associate necessarily exploitation with networks. That's an interesting example where the device is compromised. But also we have situations where the network itself, in this case the cell phone network, can be used to compromise devices directly. And this was actually some research that our team did earlier this year, really earlier in 2015, focused around a specific set of vulnerabilities on Android platforms. This attack was interesting. It got a lot of press explicitly for being an MMS-based attack. The reality of the situation was the attack could be delivered in a number of different ways, network being one of those, simply by browsing to a website or getting an email link with a link to a website would cause the device, unfortunately, to become exploited, and in that case give a full root privilege access to the device, and in fact also be able to call back to the attacker in a command and control type fashion. So it's an interesting attack vector. I think the takeaway here from a community and a threat research perspective on mobile is the holy grail for an attacker is what we would call a remotely exploitable vulnerability, something that does not require us to be near or directly attached to a device, that we can have the user interact with in the same way that we would want to attack a desktop. So there's a lot of focus at a number of the security conferences and from the researchers, and these kind of vulnerabilities go for big bucks. In the underground community forums, you'll see opportunities to sell, if you find these types of vulnerabilities, for quoted up to $1 million. And one can understand that a lot of these exploits that don't get publicly reported are being unfortunately sold, because these are high value, especially from a surveillance perspective. So interesting focus for us, but ultimately the holy grail for the attacker is really being able to own that device, and more importantly, become persistent on that device. And really the only way to recover from that persistence is to perform an entire firmware flash of those devices, or in the iOS, on the iOS side of the house, really a full recovery of that device.
Okay, and that's probably the call the help desk doesn't want to take, a bunch of firmware flashes because you've been hacked on your mobile device. So, I mean, we've talked about the networks, the apps, the devices, and we've got both types of people. Those interested in security, those from the MDM and the MobileIron customers. How does this all work together?
Yeah. So the opportunity for Zimperium and MobileIron to provide a very strong and compelling conjoined solution is very exciting for us. On the Zimperium side, we're very focused on threat detection and mitigation. We are very focused around detection of malicious networks and the attacker manipulating those networks. So that could be anything from Wi-Fi networks ultimately through to cell towers. We see a large amount of attacks in this area on a daily basis. We also are very passionate about malware detection. Mike talked about the shift to apps. We see apps, especially in 2015, the uptick has been very interesting. So apps as a delivery mechanism for permissions abuse, but also, as we saw in 2015, for extended or more privileged access to those devices. The third area, from a Zimperium perspective, that we're very passionate about is the device itself. There's a number of different areas that we really provide value for our customers. The first is around a vulnerability perspective of those devices. So, allowing the customer to understand, is this device potentially vulnerable to this exploit before they even see those attacks, through to the ability then to proactively detect exploitation of those devices directly. And one of the things at Zimperium we're very proud of is the fact that we're doing this on device. So if the device is disconnected from the network, or the attacker has control of that network, that's something that we want to be able to target and immediately be able to detect those types of threats. But really, the power for our customers really comes into play when you combine what we can bring from a threat visibility, a threat detection, a forensics capability, with the power of the MobileIron platform itself. It's a huge and very compelling integration directly with the compliance capabilities to be able to automate the remediation of devices in the situations, and unfortunately, when attackers are probing these devices, to be able to proactively mitigate those threats via the MobileIron platform is something that we've had a great will. We are extremely proud when we bring that forward to a lot of our conjoined prospects. And Mike, I'm sure you can add more.
Sure. In terms of the integration, I think the simplest way to think about it is leveraging all the cool detections that Zimperium has, as well as the protections. But the integration with MobileIron is about the ability to take action. So leveraging that additional intelligence we get from Zimperium, having the ability to respond to a threat. If we take a look at, some of the things we do fundamentally at MobileIron, sure, we have people register their device and then can enforce various lockdowns and restrictions. These range from something simple as enforcing a passcode, encryption, other types of security controls. And then as you start to take a look at that from an app and data perspective, it's, hey, let's deploy various profiles for access to corporate resources, either on the network or in the cloud, as we deploy apps and their profiles to the device. When we start to take a look at that from a security standpoint, we want to ensure the security posture of that device remains sound. How do I detect if the device has been jailbroken, rooted, or compromised? That's something we do fundamentally in the product, and we've done for some time. People kind of think of that as a binary function. It's either jailbroken or not, or it's either rooted or not. But it's not really the case. We've got hundreds of checks, lots of if-then statements that really take a look at the security posture of that device from a device level. In other words, from an iOS standpoint, there are various forms of jailbreak. In fact, there are anti-detection tools that hide the fact that the device has been jailbroken, such as XCon and other types of tools. If you take a look at it from an Android perspective, certainly with the fragmentation, it's even more complicated than that. Is there a custom ROM on the device that came from the factory? Even though the device isn't fully rooted, maybe there is some privilege escalation capabilities as a result of that custom ROM. Maybe there's certain data exposures that come about from leveraging that custom ROM. Has somebody enabled the Android debug bridge or USB controls to sideload an app? So these are all, just some of the many detections that we have that can trigger a quarantine. And we leverage that same type of quarantine capability in all the intelligence we get from Zimperium as well, in particular with their network detections, their app capabilities, and even the proactive mechanisms that John spoke earlier in terms of the mechanisms for potential vulnerabilities. So at the end of the day, having that ability to do a selective or full wipe of the device, most people use a selective wipe, and as a result, go ahead and remove that sensitive data from the device to avoid a data breach.
A good example of that is a project we worked on very recently together with a online media organization, and they had good forensic staff internally. They had identified a number of different breaches on mobile devices. They looked to Mobileye and ourselves to provide a solution. Initially to understand what the vulnerability perspective was of those devices. Are my devices in the field vulnerable to specific attacks or vulnerabilities? But then, as a conjoined solution, be able to detect further exploitation of the devices and also of the network attacks that they were seeing, especially with their traveling user base. One of the other things that our customers find particularly compelling, and was certainly the case in this particular customer's instance, was we provide a huge amount of forensic capability about the devices. Even if you have great forensic staff in your organization, that's typically much larger enterprises in my own personal experience. Mobility research capabilities are still something that end users, so customers, are really getting to grips with. And even then, if you have somebody that has good mobility forensic capabilities, the challenge that they face is by the time they get the device, often a lot of the context has really been lost about that attack. So one of the value propositions that we were able to bring to the table there in conjunction with Mobileye was actually the ability for us to be able to collect all of that forensic information at the time of attack and also link that to their SIEM environment, so they're able to get context around the user as a whole, both from their desktop perspective and from their mobile perspective. Then, when we see those threats, for Mobileye to be able to apply automatically compliance policies, a number of those were defined for different conditions and different types of attacks to ensure that they had put in place a scalable solution that would serve them here for the longer term. So we get asked, I think it's probably worth noting, we get asked, how does this work? How do we actually even connect these solutions together, and how does the integration work? Well, it's actually really straightforward. I mean, from the Mobileye side, we connect Mobileye to the Zimperium console. That provides us a number of value propositions. From a deployment perspective, it synchronizes users and devices and any associated labels of those devices as well. You deploy our app out via the normal mechanisms in Mobileye to deploy the app. That could be through a store or enterprise style deployment. And then the app is automatically logged in through the initial synchronization that we've done with Mobileye. So there's no user piece really involved in this at all. The app's just simply deployed in the same way that any other application would be. Now, we then go immediately into, obviously, a detection and mitigation stance. If we detect a threat on the device or being directed at the device, we're able to collect immediately both the forensic and the event information, but also then be able to update in real time any labels on the Mobileye side that allows an automated process to be able to implement those compliance and quarantine restrictions that you would want to apply depending on the different types of threats. And that's very granular. You're able to apply a number of different compliance actions depending on a number of different conditions. So from the Zimperium side, we have a broad range of threat types, everything from network scans right through to full device compromise. And that allows our joint customers to be able to put a very fine-grained control, if they wish, around how they would handle and automate both the deployment, but ultimately the mitigations.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, John. Thanks, John. So that really concludes our presentation. I wanted to offer this time for some live Q&A to our speakers. If you do have a question, just go ahead and type it in the right-hand side of your window there, and we'll get to those as is. We've got a couple already that we'll get started with. We also have a data sheet on both of the solutions available in the handout section of your window. You're free to download that and take a look at it and review it anytime, or just go to Zimperium.com or mobileiron.com and take a look or contact your rep. Also want to take the opportunity to plug Mike's book again, Mobile Data Loss. Please check his Twitter and find the link to go ahead and grab a copy of that book that is available. I'm sure he'd appreciate a review as well. But so Mike, with the run through of all the device level network attacks, app attacks, which one of these vectors, if any, really stick out with your customers? What do they ask you about in terms of those vectors?
All three come up, frequently. I think because malware tends to grab a lot of the headlines, I think that's the same case with mobile, and as a result, I would say out of those three, probably the most common question is around app threats. There's certainly a lot of concern folks have around jailbroken or rooted devices, but we're seeing, malware more frequently than we are, new forms of jailbreaks or rooting for that matter. So, between Xcode Ghost, YSpectre, KeyRaider, a lot of those things that through the fall, it just seemed one popped up after another. We've been getting a lot of questions around that. The other interesting statistic that we had that was quite interesting was, we provided some scripts to allow people to kind of detect Xcode Ghost in the presence of it in their environment. And the results were quite staggering. We did find that a lot of customers actually had Xcode Ghost, in their environment. And for those customers, they immediately started to take a look at solutions like Zimperium. So it's certainly apps, and just to sum it up, customers want the ability to identify not only malware, but some of those potential vulnerabilities that John outlined earlier. So that has been a frequent question that's been coming up more lately is, how can I be more proactive about this? We do remind them that from a MobileIron standpoint, we really look to combine, both those proactive protections along with reactive, and complement that with live monitoring to really provide that true defense in depth. If you do have concerns about malware, not only do we strongly recommend that you take a close look at Zimperium, but in addition to that, keep in mind we've got our App Connect containerization both for iOS and Android, and that's meant to provide an additional barrier for protecting the enterprise data from those kinds of threats. But we would never recommend you solely rely on that, right? Any defense in-depth strategy would always outline both a proactive, reactive, and live monitoring approach, as John prescribed earlier.
John, are you seeing the same thing? Applications over network and device, or what's the combination?
I think when we speak with customers and prospects and analysts, one of the things that I think is a challenge, and if I just step back and think about it with my security hat on here, is I think the first thing that's a real challenge is visibility. I think just understanding what we face now from a mobile perspective is a really interesting challenge. If we look at the approach that we've typically taken as security practitioners on the desktop, we've probably got quite a mature stance at this point. We've got some anti-malware technology. If we're sensible, we've probably also got some sort of host-based IPS technology for exploitation and some sort of network-based firewalling technology on our devices. And we have a way to capture those incidents when they're occurring and ultimately know how to handle and mitigate those. On the mobile side, we're still somewhat blind, to be frank. A lot of the customers come to us with, we really don't have a great deal of visibility. I don't know how many of my devices are getting network attacks, rogue access point attacks in New York City or in China. I simply don't know that, and therefore I don't really know what type of data we've even potentially lost at this point. So one of the first things that we often find that people are asking us to help them with is providing the visibility. The next thing they want is forensics. They want to understand what happened so that they internally can decide a strategy on how to handle those. I think certainly in the last year, something that's been top of mind has certainly been around the device itself. And by the device, I encompass what Mike says by apps, because the app vector to ultimately own the device is really what the attack is targeting. So that's the ultimate concern. The ultimate concern is what is it that I can do, and how is it I can approach this problem to give me a confidence? How can I go back to my CISO and say, yes, we've got this covered, yes, we understand our risk posture, and more importantly, have some sort of strategy in place to mitigate those. And the attack vectors, they will continue to grow. And I think from our perspective, the one that's often missed, and we see a huge amount of attacks, is just on the network. The network itself, Mike made that point, the user, that end user as well, being the weak link there. But all of those being ultimately an approach to own the device is a problem that we're going to face, and certainly at Zimperium we're asked more and more about.
Perfect. Well, that's our time. That's 45 minutes. It really flew by. John, any closing thoughts? 15 seconds?
No, I think really we've summarized it. I think we're moving into a different age now. Mobile is now being treated as the next desktop, and I think that statement's been overused in the industry generically in the last number of years. But the shift that we see of apps, the deployment of tablets now to replace traditional desktop PCs, means that as security practitioners, we really need to get that, not only the visibility, but ensure the ability to detect and ultimately have a proactive life cycle, leveraging integrations with technologies like MobileIron to be able to provide a consistent and automated way to handle these threats, and ultimately to be able to scale to the challenge of providing access to these new users and these new devices.